Thank you. You see, your education will always haunt you. So as an alumni, I am very pleased to be here. Dirk, thank you very much for the invitation. Dennis also. First of all, let me say that being here with you is a very exciting moment, because when I first learned about the work of the T20, and in a sense it's focusing on a more serious and sustained engagement with the G20 process, my first reaction was, this is something that echoes very much to where I find myself now, heading the Oxford Martin School within the University of Oxford, and a school that was established specifically to look at 21st century challenges from the point of view of interdisciplinary research, and particularly with a view to delivering solutions as opposed to just analysis. And in that sense, I must also say it's been a very exhilarating day to sit here, because just by virtue of the quality of the discussions, it proves that this is not a G20 expert group. And I say this not with disrespect to all the experts that the G20 assembles on many of the topics, but I use it as an entry point to reflect on one question that has been part of my thinking as I listened to the discussions today. What is the self-defined relationship and identity of this T20 in relation to the G20? It carries within it the analogy, the ambition, the signal that this is about thinking, about think tanks, about evidence-based analysis. It is not about consulting, and it is not just about providing advice that was asked for. So the first thing is, how can the T20 deliver on at least a self-defined, as I interpret it, but also an expectation, I think, out there, that the G20 needs to be more than just the, let's say, more narrowly focused economic and financial crisis management tool, but as many of you have invoked in all the working groups this afternoon, a key part of addressing a world that finds itself in a very troublesome moment, whether in purely economic and financial terms, in political terms, or in geopolitical terms. So it cannot just be another expert group, because then you could all be just sitting in these various expert groups that G20 presidencies now convene excellently. And you will be asked specific questions, and you will also note that only those things that are desirable will be taken on board, on record. The other thing that distinguishes, in my mind, the T20 also is that it is not like the B20 or the C20, a stakeholder group that is being invited into the process of the G20. Or is this group of think tanks and research groups just another stakeholder group? I think it's an important issue to reflect on, because I think, in my interpretation, it is not. If the discipline and rigor of research and empirical evidence and the inherent assumption that think tanks are not without views, but are not principally here to advocate just on a single issue, but rather to bring an understanding in terms of methodological but also analytical capacity to complex issues, then there is a very unique relationship that the T20, I think, deserves to demand of itself, and that I think over time, in fact, the G20 will come to appreciate, and I think probably is already, because otherwise we would not have seen the senior level engagement of the German presidency and in prior events. But then the question is, why focus on the G20? Because, as many of you have alluded today, and it's interesting, multilateralism, the United Nations, there is the G20. The G20 has assumed the power to lead. It's de facto power, but it's not de jure power. It is not legitimacy in the sense of a global community having deferred to a group of countries the role of leadership. It is an assumed role that the G20 occupies, and it is something that we must continue to reflect on, because there is absolutely every reason for a group of think tanks and research institutions to engage with this group, precisely because it has the power to make a difference. But in the way that this group acts on its own behalf and on behalf of others is an extremely fine line, or an extremely important line to draw. At the end of the day, the G20 cannot be an alternative forum for global governance and decision-making. At least that would be my departure point. It does not have the legitimacy to do so, even though it has every de facto reason to be called upon to provide leadership. And many of you have spoken to the different areas here. It is also interesting that at this particular moment in time, both, I would argue already during the last few presidencies, particularly also the Chinese presidency and now in the German presidency, the G20 agenda is moving from that narrower focus, and some would argue this has been happening already for a number of years, of economic and financial issues, and others would say crisis-driven management, to broadening that focus. And I think much of what we have discussed and what I have followed in the discussions here today validates this approach, because you cannot try and deal with global challenges in the financial and economic sphere without addressing the related phenomena, be they in the natural resource domain, be they in certain continents that are either excluded or included in decision-making and otherwise. But again, I would argue it is perhaps important for us to not allow ourselves to be tempted to interpret the broadening of the focus beyond the economic dimension of G20 to automatically assuming that this also then provides a global mandate for the G20 economies to govern what happens in the global context. If anything, I deeply welcome, I must say, Chancellor Merkel's leadership in saying the G20 must reinvent and re-explain itself to the public. But it should not, in the same sentence, say, and therefore we will solve the problems of the world because the United Nations can't solve it, or the OECD can't, or SADC, or the African Union, ASEAN, you name them, all these other fora. No, it should be broadening the agenda because it makes sense, but with a focus on what happens in the G20 economies, which in turn will determine what happens to others. And I think, again, this is an important focus to bring to perhaps the thinking of our work. And let me also use this moment to say that I believe this group has an immensely important role in rescuing an appreciation of the notion of globalization at a moment in time where it has become emblematic and symbolic of systemic failures across our global economic, governance, and political system. You all who sit in this room here, I would assume, know that globalization is not an issue that you either believe in or you don't believe in. We are bound by destiny, by economic reality, by resource, by climate change and emission driving factors, bound to act as a global community. And therefore globalization is tragically become a debate about whether you believe in it or not, when really it should be about the kinds of choices that globalization has argued are inevitable and imposed on us, that have made globalization now symbolic of a failure. I take this also in the context, and this is my second point, of the current political turmoil. I don't know if you realize that you are sitting in a building here that is not only a building that has a history as a financial institution, then an Academy of Sciences. In these pillars you see the bullet holes of a war called a World War. They were left deliberately here, as they have also been left in the German Parliament, to remind ourselves that right here where we sit now as a community of intellectuals, scientists from all over the world, there was a world war played out. And it's only 70 years ago. And yet in the middle of Europe, it was extraordinary for me to witness a Europe incapable of articulating the European vision in the year 2016 that led after this cataclysm and catharsis of the Second World War to Europe being led by an idea and an ideal to build itself a different kind of future, which has remarkably made this continent largely one without war and conflict. And here we are in the midst of a situation where acting globally together cohesively is more important than ever, and we are seeing a political reaction unfold that we should have probably seen coming earlier. And I think it is also an indictment to many of our disciplines and our work that we did not recognize this. But the point is not, and I think this is also important, to suddenly believe that, you know, half of the voters of the United States or of the United Kingdom or parts of Europe have turned into racists, that xenophobia now defines the identity of our societies. No, what we are witnessing is a reaction to something that I believe is what we also can associate with globalization, that those who say that these are the rules of the game and who set them, be they governments, the G20, be they the experts amongst us, there are some who are part of this caste that is now apparently no longer worth listening to. Are we capable of actually understanding that, no, our societies have not suddenly gone mad? What they are is reacting with a degree of frustration to having essentially been disenfranchised to the point where the only thing you can do is to react. This economic determinism that is also symbolized by, you know, the global trade agenda, globalization, the G20, the most powerful countries that have the greatest to benefit from globalization, setting the rules of the game that for another 165 countries set all the rules in turn, translate down into realities that people are reacting against. The freedom to choose is, I think, actually what people are now so conscious of having lost, including through the financial crisis, that they are voting not with their heads, but with their hearts, anger, frustration. Are we capable at this moment in time as a community of think tanks to actually articulate a positive narrative of why globalization is not something that we can either believe in or not believe in, choose or not choose to be part of, but to offer a vision that goes beyond that crisis management and the summitry of communiques to articulate a vision of what many of you have spoken to today, economic transformation and leadership by the very nations who, through history and contemporary economic and political reality, will actually be able to change the destiny of 7 billion people because they control a vast proportion of our global economy. And therein lies, I think, our challenge to, particularly when I was listening to the summary from the groups, our challenge is not to allow ourselves, hopefully, to try and write the more intelligent cheat sheet for the writing of the communique of the next summit, but rather to draw out the connections and the longer-term trajectories that will allow the kind of economic transformation to take place that will make decarbonization not something that threatens the South or makes people in the coal industry in the United States become paranoid, but rather allow a global transition towards a low-carbon economy to emerge as an opportunity, which in turn will address some of the risks that will drive that debate about migration, which in turn will hopefully help the G20 to begin to finally, and I want to particularly thank Professor Garth Lepere for the way he framed it, to rewrite the narrative about the G20 in Africa. I am in the midst of actually commissioning a research program in my new school in the University of Oxford about African futures, precisely with an understanding that the world is so entrapped in its comprehension of Africa today that it is completely overlooking that in 30 to 40 years' time, what is happening between now and then on the African continent will have such profound impacts on G20 economies that to talk of charity or even of development aid as a vision for a compact is a complete misnomer. Just take the example of climate change. If Africa chooses the energy matrix path of the G20 over the 20th century, the Paris Agreement is dead. Africa will double its population in the next 30 to 40 years. Another 1.3 billion people will come onto the electricity grids of this continent. So for the G20 to not view the leapfrogging of Africa into a renewable energy economy as not only a valid way of investing in the anti-poverty and development pathways of a continent that soon will account for 2 billion people in our global family, but to see the extraordinary necessity of having a decarbonized energy backbone for Africa's accelerated economic development and the Agenda 2063 is hardly being articulated. I am sometimes disappointed intellectually in where the development discourse is still engaged when it comes to Africa. So here, in this configuration, we have an opportunity to reset this discussion. Not because the problems of Africa are not real. And I deliberately called in our school the call African futures, because there is no singular future, nor will there be one cohesive future across the continent. But not to appreciate that the relationship between Africa and the G20, and therefore the rest of the world, will fundamentally reset itself in just 2 or 3 decades is an extraordinary challenge to all of us, and I think an opportunity in the context here. Let me end, because I know time is running and the drinks are waiting and the finger food, is just to say that we, I think with the G20, are now confronted with the most profound challenge of accelerating economic transformation. With all the elements that are not just in the financial and economic policy domain, but in part what I witnessed in the discussion about the SDGs this afternoon. Perhaps our greatest hope is that that transformation, with the SDGs now being an integral part of this, and I would argue in some ways the SDGs have been the missing half of the globalization discourse for the last 30 years, which was so singularly dominated by trade and free trade and global markets and competitiveness and outcompeting one another, that we completely forgot that that is not how societies function. But also to help the G20 articulate what is its leadership responsibility, something that was again echoed, I think, throughout a number of the groups here. And hopefully through that, make the G20 what I think many would love it to be. A group of countries that accept the responsibility to be the drivers of innovation and transformation, while at the same time being also a group of countries that are conscious that they have a leadership responsibility and not simply the opportunity to dominate global geopolitical debates by virtue of their size and influence due to the size of their economies. So these are a few thoughts to offer at the end of a day, and I hope in the way that we are able to work together, and certainly I am deeply committed with my colleagues in the Oxford Martin School to contribute to, I think, the fascinating work that you have already laid out. So thank you for the opportunity and have a good evening.